Hi, this is Steven Rothberg. I'm the president and founder of College Recruiter, the leading niche job board for recent graduates and students. Today I'm joined by Todd Raphael, editor-in-chief of ERE Media. Todd, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Steve. It's great to be here to talk about college recruiting. What else will we talk about? With Steven Rothberg from collegerecruiter.com. I've noticed so much happening forget college recruiting, with college in general. You hear about this new college, I'm just reading about it, Minerva, where I think it's like an elite college, but you only pay $10,000 a year and you live on campus, but you go for 3 years, I think. It's a lower cost alternative, but still supposed to be elite. Then you have all these online classes. You have these places like Khan Academy. You have Coursera. Something's just happening. And one thing I think we should talk about is, what does that mean for employers? Are they changing how they pursue college recruiting, college relations because college is changing? Or are they kind of behind and haven't really changed how they spend their time and money yet?
I think that there are a very small number of employers who are changing the way that they recruit recent grads and students. Recent grads for entry-level jobs, students for primarily internships. It's like turning a battleship, though. When you're talking about a Fortune 1000 company, a federal government agency, no change comes quickly unless it's really forced on them, and then that's really just a crisis, a 08-09 recession kind of thing. But when it comes to university relations or recruiting of students and recent grads by these large organizations, most of them, they plan out their on-campus recruiting, the off-campus using digital media and other means, typically like a year or so in advance. So like right now in April of 2015, they are planning how many people they're going to hire into what areas from which schools and majors, and these people won't report for 14 more months. So when you have these evolutions in the college space, it takes a while for these organizations to catch up. Now, outside of that large organization, the smaller organizations, the 50-person company, the 200-person company, most of them have never been all that concerned about what school somebody went to. They're far more concerned about the major and where that person lives than they are in what name is on their diploma. So I think that in certain fields too, I think you're going to see IT, sales, fields like that, where the specific school has never really mattered all that much to most employers. It's much more about your skills. What internships did you have?
It's funny because some things you read and you hear seem to indicate that, like some of the data coming from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that going to college is more important than ever. But then other things you hear seem to say the opposite, that companies are becoming much more into what can you do, not where did you go to school, or even did you go to school at all, because they're finding apparently that it doesn't correlate that much to success on a job. You mentioned small employers, but then of course there's now famous Google example, where Google did a study and they figured out that people who went to elite colleges didn't necessarily perform better than people who didn't go to elite colleges, and I believe somewhat similar results to people who barely went to college at all. So that's not a small employer, 50 to 100 people, I think you mentioned. But you don't think that Google type thing is really changing a lot of big employers? They're not really saying where you went to college or if you went to college isn't that important. They're still, when you go to apply for a job at a big company, you got to check some box, and you got to say you went to college and you went to 5 or 7 years of experience doing blah, 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 right?
Yeah, for sure. I do think that there's a big difference between the kinds of positions that Google has, mostly IT and sales, versus the positions that a lot of other employers would have, let's say, accounting, engineering, where you do need to have a degree in order to be employed in that occupation, right? You cannot be an engineer without an engineering degree. I think that there's a tendency amongst some HR leaders, whether they're a senior vice president of talent acquisition or they're a recruiter who has been on a job for 2 weeks, to use your college education as a litmus test, and it's pretty artificial. But if you just got 200 applications for a position and 50 of them seem to be qualified, how do you whittle that down to maybe 5 that you want to interview? And there are a whole lot of really good ways of doing it. A bad way that I think is really common is to look at the school they went to. It's objective, right? You're not probably going to be discriminating against somebody based upon age, race, gender, the sort of the usual problem categories simply based upon the school they go to. And there's certainly some exceptions to that. The HBCUs, the historically black colleges and universities, for example. If you excluded everybody from those schools, you've got some questioning is going to be coming your way. But if you're a really large employer, like one of our clients is one of the big accounting and consulting companies, and they've found, and they can demonstrate it with data, that if you didn't graduate from one of about 70 schools, 70, the likelihood of you being hired, the likelihood of you succeeding in their workplace plummets. But I think they're the exception. I think Google is much more the norm.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is when you talk about that kind of data, fine, I understand it, I guess I believe that it's true, but when you bring it down to an individual level, and I know someone, I can tell you his name if you want, I know someone who didn't go to college, he tried, I think he went a little bit, he's now 50 exactly, so we're talking 3 decades ago. 3 decades ago, for personal reasons, financial reasons, he didn't graduate college, and when you bring it down to an individual level, he's a successful sales guy. He's worked in marketing at ADP and all these other companies. And he gets slammed out of these ATSs all the time because he didn't graduate college. You bring it down to one person, you think it's a little frustrating. It's a little sad because
very
regardless of whether statistically what you're saying is true.
Yeah, very frustrating, I would say. I do think that there is an evolution in talent acquisition to look more at the actual skills people have than in sort of proxies to those. And a proxy to me would be, what was your job title? Does that prove that you could actually do your job? Well, it's a decent indicator. It's a proxy, but it doesn't mean that you were good at it. So let's see if we can somehow test for that. Did you go to Stanford? Well, that's awesome. So you did really well in high school, and your parents probably have a lot of money. So that's awesome. Is that an indicator that you can do well in a highly competitive environment? Yeah, it probably is. But maybe a test of some type would be better. Looking back at your actual work performance. There are people who hire a lot of salespeople that I know, and they could absolutely care less what the candidate does in the interview. Because, you can fool anybody for 30 minutes when you're talking about just about anything, but it's like, let's look at the last few jobs that you've had. Have you actually been able to sell their products or services? And if not, what's the common denominator? Is it the products or services by multiple companies that you work for, or is it you? Is it somehow you're not a good salesperson? I think that's a little harder when you're talking about a student who has little to no experience.
We just talked about college versus no college. What about online college versus not online? It used to be, I think, when online colleges started, it was almost like a stigma. It was almost like I don't know. That wasn't really a college. And now, I don't know if it's not a stigma, like a scam, but I don't know if it's fully accepted. Like you might say, I got an MBA online from somewhere, or I got this executive education degree online. It's almost like a qualifier. Whereas if you buy a dresser, you might just say, I got it from Target. You might not have to explain to people you bought it online as if it's a different kind of dresser. So, or, I got it from IKEA. You wouldn't really have to explain that it's IKEA online because it's the same dresser. What about college?
I would say, I totally agree that there is There's a stigma to it, at least a red flag, if nothing else. Um, some of the products that we offer to our employer clients are things like targeted email campaigns or targeted mobile banner advertising, where employers can say to us, hey, we want to target the juniors and seniors who are in engineering programs who go to any of these 20 schools. Never do the employer clients that are even just considering those products, never do they list online schools. They're just never included in the list of schools that they're targeting. Now,
and doesn't it just ever come with the territory? Like if they say Michigan State, doesn't Michigan State Online ever just sort of come with that?
Exactly. So one of the changes that I think most of these employers don't really appreciate is the fact that, you know, when they went to college, there were not online schools. We used to call it correspondence, was kind of the closest equivalent, or distance learning. Now it's an online, but it's really the same thing. Michigan State and other excellent schools almost all now offer online courses. And I think if an employer was targeting Michigan State students and they were looking at a student who went to the traditional campus in Lansing versus a student in Santa Clara who went to the online university, I think that employer would be surprised. Oh, I didn't think about the fact that this person might have gone to Michigan State online. If they thought about it, if they were faced with that choice, I think that virtually every employer would pick the student who went to the traditional campus. Not because I think there's a big difference in the education quality. That Santa Clara student might be much better than a student who went to the traditional campus in Lansing, but because it's the safer choice. They used to say years and years ago, nobody ever got fired for buying a computer from IBM. It's the safe choice. You're not going to go wrong with hiring somebody from Lansing. And at the end of the day, we all like our paychecks. Nobody wants to get fired. So if you've got two well-qualified candidates, I think it's only human nature to pick the one that's a lesser risk. And that would be the traditional campus student.
It seems like it would take a lot of discipline to spend 4 years sitting there in your garage watching classes versus just being drunk while you show up to class late. Hungover in person, but what do I know?
Well,
One
one thing I would add is that I was reading recently that most college students today graduate with some of their classes having been online. So now how do you account for that? I mean, just a few years ago, you were either traditional or you were online. Now I think the reality is even the online students, it's blended. They'll take some of their classes at a physical campus. My brother-in-law years ago went to the University of Phoenix at a campus school and got a master's in engineering. If he were to do that again today, I bet some of his classes would be in a traditional campus environment and some of them would be online.
Yeah. Before we go, just sort of segue to a non sequitur, not totally non sequitur, but what about education itself, like high school or even way younger? Is it working? Is it like, it sounds like college is changing, but is like public or private education for younger people, is it changing too? Is it preparing people for the way life and work are being done now? It's an argument that I've had with other parents. Some parents think that some schools should be, like elementary schools, should be very formal and very rules-based, and you need to kind of bring back that tradition. Other people think that schools should be informal and looser and more collaborative and all that stuff, like the workplace is becoming.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think education is on the spectrum of keeping up with the workplace or not?
Yeah, my wife and I have three kids. One who's 20, another who's a high school senior, 18, a third who's a high school sophomore, 16. I can speak to the school district that they're in. It's a public school district in the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis area. It's a very good school district. And I see their education compared to what mine was. And I see a much greater emphasis on two things. One's great, one's awful. The great thing is they get far more critical thinking projects, or just it's integrated into almost everything that they do by their good teachers. And they have some bad teachers who don't do that at all. But I think there's a much greater emphasis amongst probably in the better schools, better school districts, better teachers on critical thinking skills. That's ridiculously important. When we have employees who excel, they have great critical thinking skills. When we have employees who struggle, they lack critical thinking skills. To just look at something and say, does this make sense? And to be able to figure that out is something that's hard for too many people. The thing that I don't like is the emphasis on testing. And it's directly contradictory. You spend 100 hours testing, that's 100 hours less in being able to teach critical thinking skills. So I think that there's some pros and cons in education in the primary and secondary schools today. I think more and more of them also feel that there's sort of an assumption that the better students, most of them, are going to go for some kind of college or education, whether it's an associate's degree, whether it's a bachelor's, whether it's a master's. So preparing sort of this, let's call it the smarter kids, the more motivated kids for the workforce, I think is a thing of the past. I think they look at the post-secondary schools now for that. Preparing the kids who struggle with schoolwork, who are less motivated for the workforce, I think is continuing.
From my observation, I'm not an expert in this, they're too prepared. And what I mean by that is, what I hear is college is easier than high school in some ways. And they're exhausted by school and they're doing homework for several hours a night. But again, probably a conversation for a future webinar. Anyhow, I think we've covered well online schooling, in-person schooling, the allocation of time, dollars to schools versus new types of schools, and more. So with that, we may need to save the rest for another day.
That's awesome. Todd, before we leave off, how about if you let people know, if they want to reach you, what the best way of doing that would be? Sure,
I'm at todd@ere.net by email, but our website for recruiters, in-house recruiters, is ere.net. We also have sourcecon.com for sourcers, tlnt.com for HR people, and Fordyce Letter for third-party recruiters, but ere.net for in-house recruiters.
Cool. And I'm a subscriber to ERE Daily, as you know. I was one of the very first people. The founder, David Manister, was still working at TMP and kind of had this little listserv on the side. I think it was probably... Well, when did he start? 1996, 1997, something like that?
I think it was like maybe 97 or 8, something like that.
Yeah, so I think I was probably amongst the first, 3,000-4,000 people who subscribe. So you guys do amazing work. You're definitely one of the best sources of information for corporate and third-party recruiters. So thank you for joining me and for the conversation on college and university recruiting. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. You too.
Thanks, Todd.